A place of ancient beauty. Red rocks rising from the desert like nature's cathedral. Tourists come from all over the world to witness the massive sandstone monolith that the indigenous people have revered for thousands of years. For the Chamberlain family, it was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip. Michael Chamberlain, a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, had driven his wife Lindy and their 3 children to Ayers Rock, as it was called back then. Their sons, Aidan, who was 6, and Reagan, who was 4, were excited about the adventure. And then there was the baby. Azaria Chamberlain. 9 weeks old. Dark hair. Beautiful dark eyes. A healthy, happy infant who had no idea this would be her last day on Earth. The family set up their tent at the Ayers Rock campground around sunset. It was winter in Australia, which meant the desert cooled down quickly once the sun disappeared. Other families were camped nearby. Barbecues sizzled. Children laughed. It was the kind of ordinary evening that you never think will turn into a nightmare. Lindy fed baby Azaria around 8 p.m. in the tent while Michael prepared dinner outside. The baby was content, freshly changed, ready for sleep. Lindy laid her down in the bassinet inside the tent, near where the boys would sleep. At approximately 8:10 p.m., Lindy heard a cry. Not a long cry. Just a brief sound. The kind any baby might make. She called out to Michael, "Is that Azaria?" But before he could answer, Lindy was already moving toward the tent. What happened in the next 30 seconds would change this family's life forever. Would thrust them into a nightmare that combined grief with something far worse, suspicion. Would divide an entire nation and expose the darkest corners of human nature. Lindy Chamberlain approached the tent. She pulled back the flap. And then she screamed. "Michael! The dingoes got my baby! The dingoes got my baby!" Inside the tent, the bassinet was empty. The blankets were disturbed. And Azaria Chamberlain was gone. A frantic search began immediately. Michael grabbed flashlights. Fellow campers joined in. They scoured the area around the campsite, calling out for the baby, searching the scrubland, looking for any sign. But Azaria had vanished into the Australian night. And with her disappearance, one of the most controversial criminal cases in Australian history had just begun. The question that would haunt everyone for years to come was simple, yet impossible to answer. What really happened to baby Azaria? The night of August 17th descended into chaos. Within minutes of Lindy's scream, dozens of campers had abandoned their dinners and joined the search. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping across the red sand, the Spinifex grass, the scattered rocks. Azaria! Azaria! Voices called out, though everyone knew a 9-week-old baby couldn't respond. Michael Chamberlain ran through the scrubland in his bare feet, desperately searching, praying, hoping. His pastoral training had prepared him for many things, but not this. Not the loss of his own child. A local ranger arrived within 20 minutes. Then another. Then police. "A dingo?" one officer asked, his tone already skeptical. "You're saying a dingo took your baby?" "Yes," Lindy insisted, her voice shaking but firm. "I saw it coming out of the tent. It had something in its mouth." The officer wrote this down, but his expression suggested doubt. Here's what most people outside Australia didn't know in 1980. Dingoes were wild dogs, yes, but attacks on humans were considered extremely rare. In fact, there had never been a confirmed fatal dingo attack on a human being in recorded Australian history. Never. So when Lindy Chamberlain claimed a dingo had taken her baby, many people struggled to believe it. The search continued through the night. Trackers were brought in. Aboriginal trackers who knew the land, who could read signs in the sand that others couldn't see. They found paw prints. Canine prints, consistent with a dingo. They found drag marks in the sand, leading away from the campsite. But they didn't find Azaria. By dawn, the search had expanded. Helicopters circled overhead. Volunteers formed lines and walked through the desert, shoulder to shoulder, looking for any trace of the missing infant. On the fourth day, a tourist made a discovery near Uluru. A small, white matinee jacket. The kind a baby might wear. It was Azaria's jacket, identified by Lindy immediately. But the jacket itself raised more questions than it answered. It was found neatly placed near a rock, not torn or damaged as you might expect if an animal had been involved. No blood on it. No tears. Just, placed there. 5 days after the jacket was found, another tourist spotted something else. A small jumpsuit. Again, identified as Azaria's. It was located about 4 kilometers from the campsite, partially buried in the sand. But here's what made investigators pause. The jumpsuit was inside out and torn around the neck area. There were what appeared to be small tears in the fabric. But again, very little blood. Far less than you would expect if a baby had been killed and eaten by a wild animal. The singlet and nappy that Azaria had been wearing underneath were never found. Neither was her body. Weeks passed. Then months. The search for Azaria was eventually called off, but the investigation was just beginning. A coroner's inquest was scheduled to examine the evidence and determine what had happened to Azaria Chamberlain. The media descended on the case like locusts. Newspapers ran story after story. Television crews camped outside the Chamberlain home. And slowly, subtly, the narrative began to shift. People started asking, why wasn't Lindy crying more? Why did she seem so composed? Why was she wearing makeup during interviews? Her religion was scrutinized. Seventh-day Adventists were considered odd by many Australians. Rumors began to circulate, completely false but persistent, that the name Azaria meant sacrifice in the wilderness in Hebrew. It doesn't. It means blessed by God. The whispers grew louder. Maybe it wasn't a dingo at all. Maybe the mother did it. At the first coroner's inquest in February 1981, the coroner examined all the evidence. The paw prints, the drag marks, the testimony of campers who had seen dingoes near the tents that night, the clothing found in the desert. His conclusion? Azaria Chamberlain had died as a result of being taken by a dingo. The case should have ended there. But it didn't. Because sometimes, when people want to believe something badly enough, facts don't matter. And a large portion of the Australian public wanted to believe that Lindy Chamberlain was a murderer. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're finding this case as haunting as I am, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. This story is about to get much darker. 1981 became a year of torment for the Chamberlain family. Despite the coroner's finding, despite the evidence supporting the dingo theory, the Australian media refused to let the story die. Magazine covers featured Lindy Chamberlain's face with sinister headlines, "Did this mother kill her baby?" Television programs ran specials analyzing her body language, her word choices, her clothing. Every aspect of Lindy's behavior was dissected and interpreted as evidence of guilt. She didn't cry enough? Suspicious. She wore makeup to court? Narcissistic. She spoke calmly about Azaria's death? Cold-blooded. But here's the truth about grief that the media ignored. Everyone processes trauma differently. Some people sob uncontrollably. Others go numb, retreating into composure as a survival mechanism. Neither response makes someone a killer. Lindy Chamberlain was being judged not on evidence, but on how well she performed the role of grieving mother, according to society's expectations. And she was failing that performance in the court of public opinion. The Chamberlains received death threats. People spat at them in the street. Their home was vandalized. Their other children were bullied at school. Michael lost his position as a pastor. The church, unable to withstand the public pressure, quietly distanced itself from the family. Their marriage began to crack under the strain. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, something troubling was happening. Despite the coroner's ruling, the police investigation hadn't stopped. Officers were convinced that Lindy had murdered Azaria, and they were determined to prove it. They re-examined the family's car, a yellow Holden Torana. They brought in forensic experts. They collected samples. And then they found what they were looking for. Or at least, they thought they did. In February 1982, a forensic biologist named Joy Cole examined spray patterns found in the Chamberlain's car. Using a chemical test called the orthotolidine test, she identified what she claimed was fetal blood in the car's interior. Fetal blood. Blood from a baby. She also found what she identified as a handprint in blood on Azaria's jumpsuit, suggesting the baby had been held by human hands, not carried in an animal's mouth. This was the evidence the prosecution had been waiting for. Never mind that the orthotolidine test was notoriously unreliable. Never mind that it could react to all sorts of substances that weren't blood at all, sound-deadening compound used in car manufacturing, copper dust, even certain foods. Never mind that there was no proper chain of custody for the evidence. Never mind that the testing methods used wouldn't meet modern forensic standards. The prosecution had their scientific evidence, and they were going to use it. On September 19, 1982, Lindy and Michael Chamberlain were arrested. Lindy was charged with murder. Michael was charged as an accessory after the fact. The theory the prosecution presented was horrifying. Lindy had taken Azaria to the car, cut her throat with scissors, hidden her body, and then staged the scene to look like a dingo attack. Why would she do this? The prosecution never provided a clear motive. Some suggestions included postpartum depression, religious fanaticism, or simply being a bad mother who didn't want another child. The trial began in September 1982 in Darwin. The prosecution brought in their forensic expert, Joy Cole, who testified about the blood in the car with absolute certainty. They brought in a professor of dentistry who testified that the tears in Azaria's jumpsuit were inconsistent with dingo teeth. They brought in witnesses who claimed Lindy had seemed too calm on the night of the disappearance. The defense countered with their own experts. They brought in dingo researchers who explained that dingoes absolutely could and would take a small baby. They brought in witnesses who had seen dingoes near the tent. They challenged the reliability of the forensic tests. But the damage was already done. The media had convicted Lindy Chamberlain long before the jury ever began deliberating. After a trial that lasted 7 weeks, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They returned in just over 6 hours. Guilty. Lindy Chamberlain was sentenced to life in prison with hard labor. Michael received an 18-month suspended sentence. As she was led away in handcuffs, Lindy's face remained composed, though tears streamed down her cheeks. The nation erupted in both celebration and outrage. Many Australians were convinced that justice had been served, that a child killer had been caught. But others, a growing minority, began to have doubts. What if the forensic evidence was wrong? What if the jury had been swayed by prejudice rather than proof? What if an innocent woman had just been sent to prison for a crime that never happened? Lindy Chamberlain began serving her sentence at Malawa Women's Prison in New South Wales. She was pregnant with her 4th child. And somewhere in the Australian desert, the truth about what really happened to baby Azaria remained buried, waiting to be discovered. Lindy Chamberlain gave birth to her 4th child, a daughter named Kalia, on November 17, 1982. She was allowed to hold the baby for just 1 hour before Kalia was taken away and placed in Michael's care. 1 hour. 1 hour to bond with her newborn before being returned to her prison cell. Can you imagine that? Being separated from your child, knowing you might not see her again for years, possibly decades? This was Lindy's reality. Inside Malawa prison, she was treated like any other convicted murderer. The other inmates, many of whom had seen the media coverage, were hostile. Some believed she was guilty and called her a baby killer. Others simply kept their distance. Lindy spent her days working in the prison laundry, sleeping in a small cell, and writing letters to her children. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Michael Chamberlain was trying to hold what remained of his family together. He had 3 children to raise alone, Aiden, Reagan, and now baby Kalia. He had lost his career. His reputation was destroyed. His wife was in prison. But he never stopped believing in her innocence. He also never stopped fighting for her freedom. Michael began working with a small team of supporters to challenge the conviction. They pored over the trial transcripts, looking for errors. They consulted with new forensic experts. They gathered evidence that had been overlooked or dismissed. And they found something. Remember that fetal blood that Joy Cole had identified in the Chamberlain's car? The blood that had been central to the prosecution's case? New testing revealed something shocking. It wasn't blood at all. It was sound-deadening compound, a material used in car manufacturing that contained copper and other substances that could trigger false positives in the orthotolidine test. The scientific evidence that had convicted Lindy Chamberlain was junk science. But that wasn't all. The defense team also discovered that the prosecution had withheld crucial evidence during the trial. There had been numerous reports of dingo attacks on children in the Uluru area, both before and after Azaria's disappearance. One dingo had actually dragged a child from a car just months before Azaria vanished. The child survived only because adults intervened quickly. This information had never been presented to the jury. Additionally, new examinations of Azaria's jumpsuit revealed something the original forensic dentist had missed. The tears in the fabric were absolutely consistent with canine teeth. Not scissors. Not human hands. Animal teeth. Armed with this new evidence, Michael and his legal team filed an appeal. In April 1983, the appeal was heard. And rejected. The judges ruled that while some of the new evidence was concerning, it wasn't enough to overturn the conviction. Lindy would remain in prison. Michael was devastated, but he didn't give up. He continued gathering evidence, continued fighting, continued believing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Lindy missed Kalia's first birthday. Her first words. Her first steps. She missed watching Aiden and Reagan grow up. She received letters from them, drawings, photos, but it wasn't the same as being there. The psychological toll was immense. Lindy later described those years as living in a fog, going through the motions of daily life while feeling completely disconnected from reality. But she held on to hope. Hope that the truth would eventually emerge. Hope that justice, real justice, would prevail. Then, in February 1986, something happened that would change everything. A British tourist named David Brett was climbing near Uluru when he slipped and fell into a crevice. He died from his injuries, and when authorities recovered his body days later, they made an unexpected discovery. In the same crevice, hidden among the rocks, they found something else. Something small. Something that had been there for years. Azaria's missing matinee jacket. The one Lindy had always insisted Azaria was wearing that night. The one the prosecution had claimed never existed. The one they had used as evidence that Lindy was lying about the entire dingo attack. It was there. In a dingo lair. Exactly where Lindy said it would be. When authorities reported the discovery of Azaria's jacket in a dingo lair, the news sent shockwaves through Australia. This was the jacket Lindy Chamberlain had described from the beginning. The jacket the prosecution had essentially accused her of fabricating. The jacket that had been used to paint her as a liar. And it was exactly where a dingo would have taken it. The discovery was impossible to ignore. Even the most ardent believers in Lindy's guilt had to pause and reconsider. On February 7, 1986, just days after the jacket was found, Lindy Chamberlain was released from prison. She had served 3 years and 3 months. 3 years of her life, stolen. 3 years away from her children. 3 years of being called a murderer for a crime she didn't commit. She walked out of Malawi prison to a waiting media circus. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. The public, always fascinated by this case, watched with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Was she innocent after all? Had they been wrong? Lindy was released on remission, which wasn't the same as being exonerated. It was more like a technicality, an acknowledgement that the new evidence cast doubt on the conviction, but it wasn't a declaration of innocence. It was something, but it wasn't enough. The Chamberlain family tried to rebuild their lives. They moved to a small town, trying to escape the constant media attention. They attempted to give their children some semblance of normalcy. But the damage had been done. Michael and Lindy's marriage, which had survived so much, eventually crumbled under the weight of trauma. They divorced in 1991, both emotionally exhausted from years of fighting, grief, and public scrutiny. Meanwhile, legal battles continued. A royal commission was established in 1986 to investigate the case thoroughly. This was a major governmental inquiry with the power to subpoena witnesses, examine evidence, and make official findings. The commission's investigation revealed a litany of failures. The forensic testing had been deeply flawed. Multiple experts testified that Joy Cole's identification of fetal blood was scientifically unsound. The prosecution had failed to disclose evidence favorable to the defense, a serious violation of legal ethics. The media coverage had been so prejudicial that it had likely influenced the jury, making a fair trial nearly impossible. The investigation into alternative theories, like the Dingo attack, had been inadequate from the start, with police focusing almost exclusively on building a case against Lindy. In 1987, the Royal Commission released its findings. The commission concluded that the Chamberlains' account of a Dingo attack was consistent with the evidence. It criticized the forensic procedures used in the original investigation. It recommended that the convictions be overturned. In 1988, the Northern Territory Court of Criminal Appeals formally quashed Lindy's conviction. She was officially innocent. But this still wasn't a complete exoneration. The court had simply determined that the conviction was unsafe based on the evidence. They hadn't made a definitive finding about what had actually happened to Azaria. The Chamberlains pushed for more. They wanted an official coroner's ruling that confirmed the Dingo attack. They wanted their names fully cleared. A second inquest was held in 1995. The coroner returned an open finding, meaning they couldn't determine the cause of death with certainty. Still not enough. A third inquest was conducted in 1995. Again, an open finding. The Chamberlains had been through 3 inquests, a trial, multiple appeals, a royal commission, and still didn't have the official vindication they sought. It seemed the legal system, having failed them so spectacularly, couldn't bring itself to fully admit the mistake. Years passed. The case faded from daily headlines, though it never truly left the Australian consciousness. It had become a cultural touchstone, a reference point for discussions about media bias, forensic science, and wrongful convictions. Lindy Chamberlain, now Lindy Chamberlain Creighton after remarrying, tried to move forward with her life. She wrote a book. She gave occasional interviews. She became, in a strange way, an advocate for others wrongly convicted. But she never stopped seeking the truth about Azaria's death. And in 2012, more than 30 years after her daughter's disappearance, she finally got it. A 4th inquest was convened. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. New forensic analysis. Additional reports of Dingo attacks. Testimony from wildlife experts who confirmed that dingoes absolutely could and would take a small infant. The coroner, Elizabeth Morris, reviewed everything. And on June 12, 2012, she issued her finding. Azaria Chamberlain died as a result of being attacked and taken by a dingo. Official. Final. Complete. Lindy Chamberlain Creighton was in the courtroom when the finding was read. She was 64 years old. It had been 32 years since Azaria's death. When asked how she felt, she said simply, "I'm relieved. We've always known the truth. Now everyone else knows it too. But relief doesn't undo trauma. Vindication doesn't give back lost years. Nothing could bring Azaria back." Let's talk about the forensic evidence that put Lindy Chamberlain behind bars. Because this case didn't just destroy one family. It exposed catastrophic failures in forensic science that had implications far beyond Australia. At the center of the prosecution's case was Joy Cole, a forensic biologist who testified with absolute certainty about what she found in the Chamberlain's car. Fetal blood, she said. Spray patterns indicating an arterial bleed. A handprint in blood on Azaria's clothing. To a jury of laypeople unfamiliar with forensic science, this testimony sounded authoritative, scientific, irrefutable. But it was wrong. Dangerously wrong. The orthotolidine test that Cole used to identify blood was a presumptive test, meaning it could indicate the possible presence of blood, but it could also react to numerous other substances. Copper compounds. Sound-deadening material. Certain plastics. Even some foods. Any competent forensic scientist knew this. Presumptive tests needed to be confirmed with more specific testing. Cole never did confirmatory tests. She also made another critical error. She testified with certainty about something that should have been presented as possibility. "This is blood," she said, when the proper scientific statement would have been, "This tests positive for blood, but confirmatory testing is needed." That distinction might seem small, but in a criminal trial, it's everything. The jury heard, "This is blood," and believed they were hearing objective scientific fact. They didn't know they were hearing one person's unconfirmed interpretation. The handprint on Azaria's jumpsuit was another example of junk science. Under certain lighting and with certain chemical treatments, a pattern on the fabric appeared that could, if you squinted and used a lot of imagination, look vaguely hand-shaped. But proper forensic analysis showed it wasn't a handprint at all. It was a combination of fabric weave, staining, and the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, a phenomenon called pareidolia, the same reason we see faces in clouds. Then there was the testimony from Professor Cameron, a forensic dentist who claimed the tears in Azaria's jumpsuit were inconsistent with dingo teeth. He based this on examining photographs and comparing the damage to his knowledge of canine dentition. But here's what he didn't do. Actually test his theory with real dingo jaws and similar fabric. When other researchers later did exactly that, they found that dingo teeth could absolutely create tears identical to those on Azaria's clothing. Professor Cameron had testified to something he hadn't actually tested. He had made assumptions based on limited knowledge and presented them as facts. These weren't the actions of malicious people trying to frame an innocent woman. These were the actions of experts who were overconfident in their methods, who didn't understand the limitations of their tests, who got caught up in the pressure to provide answers. But the result was the same: an innocent woman went to prison. The Chamberlain case became a watershed moment in forensic science reform. It led to serious questions about the reliability of presumptive tests, the need for confirmatory testing, the importance of blind testing, where the examiner doesn't know the expected result, the danger of forensic scientists becoming prosecution experts rather than neutral scientists, the need for better training and oversight. In the years following Lindy's exoneration, Australia implemented significant reforms to its forensic science system. Standards were tightened. Training was improved. The cozy relationship between some forensic labs and law enforcement was scrutinized. But these changes came too late for the Chamberlains. And here's the truly frightening question: how many other people are sitting in prison right now based on similarly flawed forensic evidence? How many wrongful convictions have occurred because a forensic expert testified with certainty about something they couldn't actually prove? We'll probably never know the full answer to that question. But the Chamberlain case reminds us that scientific evidence is only as good as the science behind it. And sometimes, that science is fatally flawed. While the prosecution was focused on proving Lindy guilty, they overlooked or deliberately ignored substantial evidence that supported the dingo theory. Let's examine what they missed. First, the behavior of dingoes at Uluru in 1980. Dingoes are wild dogs, native to Australia. At Ayers Rock Campground, they had become somewhat habituated to human presence. Campers fed them scraps. Tourists photographed them. Rangers had growing concerns about their boldness. In the years before Azaria's death, there were multiple documented incidents of dingoes behaving aggressively around the campground. In 1979, a dingo bit a young boy on the leg. In April 1980, 4 months before Azaria disappeared, a dingo grabbed a child by the arm in broad daylight. In July 1980, just weeks before Azaria's death, a dingo entered a tent and grabbed a sleeping child by the head, dragging them several feet before the parents intervened. That last incident was remarkably similar to what Lindy described happening to Azaria. But this evidence was never presented to the jury. The prosecution maintained that fatal dingo attacks on humans had never occurred, painting Lindy's story as impossible. What about the physical evidence at the scene? Dingo paw prints were found leading away from the tent. Drag marks in the sand, consistent with something being pulled along the ground. Multiple witnesses saw a dingo near the Chamberlain tent around the time of Azaria's disappearance. Some even saw a dingo carrying something in its mouth, though they couldn't identify what it was in the darkness. The Chamberlain's tent had holes at the bottom, exactly the right size for a dingo to push through. And then there's the clothing. Azaria's jumpsuit and singlet were found weeks after her disappearance, buried in the sand near a dingo lair. The jacket was found years later in an actual dingo den. The jumpsuit had tears around the collar and sleeves. When forensic experts later examined these tears without the pressure of a prosecution, they concluded the damage was entirely consistent with canine teeth. Dingoes have a hunting technique where they grab prey by the back of the neck. The pattern of tears on Azaria's clothing matched exactly what you would expect if a dingo had grabbed a baby that way. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from studies conducted after Lindy's conviction. Wildlife experts who had been studying dingoes confirmed that the animals absolutely could and would take a baby. Dingoes can carry prey weighing up to 15 kilograms in their mouths. Azaria weighed less than 5 kilograms. She would have been easy prey. Dingoes are opportunistic hunters. They're drawn to the scent of food, milk, and yes, infants. A sleeping baby in a tent would have registered as potential prey. The idea that dingoes don't attack humans was based on the absence of fatal attacks in recorded history, not on actual behavioral studies of what dingoes were capable of doing. It was an assumption, not a fact. And assumptions, as this case proves, can be deadly. In the years since Azaria's death, there have been additional dingo attacks that confirm what happened. In 1998, a dingo attacked a 13-month-old child at Uluru. In 2001, a 9-year-old boy was killed by dingoes on Fraser Island. Multiple other serious attacks have occurred, particularly on children. After the 2001 death on Fraser Island, it became undeniable: dingoes could and would attack humans, especially small children. The question shifted from, could a dingo do this? To, how did we ever doubt it in the first place? The answer to that question reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. People wanted to believe Lindy was guilty. They wanted it because she didn't behave the way they expected a grieving mother to behave. They wanted it because she was religious in a way they found strange. They wanted it because the alternative, that a baby could be snatched by a wild animal in front of her parents, was too terrifying to accept. If a dingo could take Azaria, then anyone's child could be vulnerable. Every camping trip could end in tragedy. Random chance, not human evil, could destroy a family. That was too frightening to contemplate. So people chose to believe in a mother's guilt instead. It was easier. More comforting in a twisted way. Evil they could understand. Evil they could punish. But random tragedy? Senseless loss? That was harder to accept. So they created a narrative where Lindy was the monster, where science proved her guilt, where justice could be served. And an innocent woman paid the price. Long before the jury in Darwin delivered their verdict, the Australian public had already convicted Lindy Chamberlain. The court of public opinion is vicious. It operates on gossip, innuendo, and confirmation bias. And once it decides someone is guilty, facts rarely matter. Let's examine how the media and public turned against Lindy Chamberlain. It started with her demeanor. After Azaria's disappearance, Lindy appeared on television interviews, speaking calmly about what happened. She didn't break down sobbing on camera. She didn't scream or wail or tear her hair out. To many viewers, this was proof of guilt. What kind of mother doesn't cry? They asked. But grief doesn't follow a script. Some people cry in public. Others cry only in private. Some people shut down emotionally as a survival mechanism. Some people compartmentalize trauma so they can function. There is no correct way to grieve. But Lindy was expected to perform her grief in a way that satisfied the public's expectations. When she didn't, she was judged for it. Then there was her appearance. She wore makeup to court. She styled her hair. She dressed neatly. How can she think about makeup when her baby is dead? People wondered. But again, this revealed more about the public's prejudices than about Lindy's guilt. Should she have appeared in court looking disheveled and broken? Would that have made her seem more innocent? Would messy hair and tear-stained cheeks have convinced people she didn't kill her child? The focus on her appearance was absurd, but it was also deeply sexist. Male defendants aren't scrutinized for wearing suits to court or combing their hair. But Lindy was judged for every aspect of her presentation. Her religion became another target. The Seventh-day Adventist Church was viewed with suspicion by many Australians. They were seen as weird, cultish, different. Rumors spread that Adventists practiced human sacrifice. They don't. This is complete fabrication. The false claim that Azaria meant sacrifice in the wilderness was repeated so often that people believed it despite no linguistic evidence supporting it. People whispered that Lindy had killed Azaria as a religious offering. This was baseless, offensive, and completely divorced from reality. But it spread anyway because it fit the narrative people wanted to believe. The media fueled the fire. Tabloids ran stories with headlines like, "Dingo baby mother to face murder charge," and, "The dingo did not take my baby," expert claims. Television programs analyzed Lindy's every word, looking for slips that might reveal her guilt. One infamous example. Lindy once said in an interview that she didn't think Azaria suffered much because dingoes kill quickly. Critics pounced on this. How could she know that? They demanded. She must have killed the baby herself. But Lindy was simply trying to comfort herself with the thought that her daughter's death was quick. It was a mother desperately hoping her child didn't experience prolonged pain. Yet it was twisted into evidence of guilt. The phrase, "a dingo took my baby," became a cultural punchline. It appeared in comedy sketches. It was parodied on television shows. Years later, it would be referenced in Seinfeld and other international programs, always for laughs. People made jokes about a mother's worst nightmare, about a baby's death, about a wrongful conviction. Think about that for a moment. A child died. A woman was wrongly imprisoned. A family was destroyed. And people laughed. Public opinion polls showed that by the time of the trial, 70% of Australians believed Lindy was guilty. The jury pool was drawn from this same population. Despite attempts at jury selection, it was nearly impossible to find 12 people who hadn't already formed an opinion about the case. The trial itself became a media circus. Every day brought new headlines. Every testimony was dissected. Every facial expression was analyzed. And through it all, Lindy Chamberlain sat in the courtroom, knowing that most of the nation had already decided she was a murderer. How do you defend yourself when everyone wants you to be guilty? How do you prove innocence when people are looking for confirmation of guilt? How do you get a fair trial when the media has already convicted you? These are questions that extend far beyond this single case. They touch on fundamental issues of justice. The presumption of innocence. The right to a fair trial. The danger of media prejudice. The power of public opinion to corrupt judicial processes. The Chamberlain case became a textbook example of trial by media. And it raised an uncomfortable question that Australia had to confront. Had their justice system failed because of the media, or had it failed because the public demanded a conviction regardless of evidence? Were they complicit in this injustice? The answer, for many Australians, was yes. And that realization was difficult to swallow. Where are you watching from? Drop your location and the time in the comments. And please, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. This story gets even more complex, and you won't want to miss what comes next. While the world focused on Lindy and Michael Chamberlain, 3 other victims of this tragedy were often overlooked. Aidan, Reagan, and Kalia Chamberlain. The children. Let's talk about what this case did to them. Aidan was 6 years old when his baby sister disappeared. He was in the tent that night. He heard his mother scream. He saw the chaos of the search. He witnessed his parents' grief. And then, in the months that followed, he watched as his mother was accused of murdering his sister. Imagine being 6 years old and having adults ask you if your mother killed your baby sister. Because that's what happened. Investigators questioned Aidan multiple times, trying to find inconsistencies in his story, trying to get him to reveal something that might incriminate his mother. But Aidan's story never changed. He saw what he saw. His mother told the truth. Still, the questioning continued. The pressure mounted. His childhood was consumed by this tragedy. Reagan was 4. Too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to feel the fear, the confusion, the instability. His mother disappeared into prison. His father struggled to hold everything together. Strangers shouted at their family in public. Other children at school called his mother a murderer. How does a 4-year-old process that? And then there was Kalia. Born in prison. Taken from her mother after 1 hour. Raised without her mother for the first 3 years of her life. Kalia has no memories of her mother during those early years. She knows Lindy only through photographs and stories from that period. That's a profound loss, even if Lindy was eventually released. The children grew up in the media spotlight, whether they wanted it or not. Photographers followed them. Reporters asked them questions. Strangers recognized them on the street. They couldn't escape their family name. They couldn't escape the association with this case. Aidan, in particular, struggled with the attention. He later described feeling like he lived in a fishbowl, constantly observed, constantly judged. When Michael and Lindy divorced in 1991, the children faced another upheaval. Their family, already fractured by tragedy and injustice, was now splitting apart completely. But here's what's remarkable. All 3 children maintained that their mother was innocent. Always. Without question. They never wavered. Aiden has spoken publicly about the case, defending his mother, explaining what really happened that night. He's had to relive the trauma repeatedly, answering the same questions over and over, dealing with people who still believe his mother was guilty. Reagan has been more private, but he too has stood by his mother. Kalia, despite having no memory of the events, has also been vocal in supporting her mother and demanding justice for Azaria. These children lost their sister. Then they lost their mother to prison. Then they lost their intact family to divorce. They lost their privacy, their childhood innocence, their sense of safety in the world. And they had to watch as the Australian public vilified their mother for years. The psychological toll must have been immense. Yet they survived. They built lives. They became adults who could speak about this tragedy with grace and dignity. That takes remarkable strength. It's easy to focus on Lindy's suffering. And it was immense. But we shouldn't forget that she wasn't the only victim. Her children were victims too. Victims of a justice system that failed their family. Victims of a media circus that destroyed their privacy. Victims of a society that was too quick to judge and too slow to correct its mistakes. Azaria's death was a tragedy. What happened afterward was a different kind of tragedy, one that could have been prevented. Let's talk about numbers. Not the emotional cost, we've covered that. Let's talk about the actual financial, professional, and social costs of this wrongful conviction. Michael Chamberlain lost his position as a pastor. His career, which he had dedicated years of education and training to, was destroyed. The church distanced itself from the family. They couldn't afford the controversy, the negative publicity, the association with a murder case. So Michael found himself unemployed, with 3 children to support and a wife in prison. He took odd jobs. He sold the family possessions. He struggled financially for years. The legal costs were astronomical. The trial itself cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then the appeals. Then the Royal Commission. Then multiple inquests. Supporters raised money for the defense, but it was never enough. The Chamberlains went into debt that took decades to repay. And here's the cruel irony. While Lindy was wrongfully convicted, the state spent millions of dollars prosecuting her. Millions of taxpayer dollars used to imprison an innocent woman. When she was finally exonerated, did the government compensate her adequately? After years of legal wrangling, the Northern Territory government eventually paid the Chamberlains $1.3 million in compensation. That might sound like a lot, but consider what they lost. 3 years of Lindy's life in prison. Michael's career. Years of legal fees and expenses. The destruction of their marriage. The trauma inflicted on their children. Their reputations, which took decades to fully restore. Can you really put a price on that? And even if you could, is $1.3 million enough? The answer is obviously no. No amount of money can give Lindy back those 3 years. No settlement can undo the damage done to her children. But beyond the Chamberlains, think about the broader costs. The cost to the justice system's credibility. When people see wrongful convictions, they lose faith in courts, in police, in forensic science. The cost to other wrongfully convicted people who might not have the resources or public support to fight their cases. The cost to actual crime victims who deserved better from law enforcement instead of watching resources wasted on a flawed prosecution. The Chamberlain case exposed fundamental flaws in how the Australian criminal justice system operated. Forensic labs that were too cozy with law enforcement. Prosecutors who withheld exculpatory evidence. Media that prejudiced potential jurors. A public too quick to judge based on emotion rather than evidence. Fixing these problems has cost millions more dollars in reforms, training, and system improvements. Was it worth it? Yes. Absolutely. But it never should have been necessary in the first place. The Chamberlains also paid a social cost that's harder to quantify. Their relationships were destroyed. Friends abandoned them. Their church community turned on them. Lindy has spoken about the profound loneliness of being seen as a monster by society. The isolation. The feeling that no one believed her except her immediate family. That kind of social death is devastating. Even after exoneration, it lingered. Some people still believe she's guilty. The jokes haven't completely stopped. The references still appear in pop culture. "A dingo took my baby" remains a punchline for people who don't know or don't care about the real story behind it. Michael Chamberlain remarried and tried to rebuild his life. He eventually regained some professional footing, working as a teacher. But he never fully recovered from the trauma. In interviews later in life, he spoke about the lasting psychological impact of those years. He died in 2017, at age 72. In his final years, he was still giving interviews about the case, still defending Lindy, still trying to ensure that Azaria's story was told correctly. He spent nearly 4 decades of his life fighting this injustice. That's a staggering cost. Lindy remarried as well, to Rick Creighton. She's now in her 70s. She's written books, given speeches, and become an advocate for justice reform. But she's also said that she never fully escaped that tent at Uluru. Mentally, emotionally, part of her is still there, watching her baby disappear into the night. That's a life sentence of a different kind. So when we ask, what did this wrongful conviction cost? The answer is, everything. It cost the Chamberlains everything. And it should cost us something too, our complacency. Because if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. Let's dive deeper into exactly how the forensic science failed in this case. Because understanding these failures isn't just about the Chamberlain case. It's about recognizing how similar failures continue to occur in courtrooms around the world. The prosecution's forensic case rested on 3 main pillars. The fetal blood in the car. The cut marks on Azaria's clothing. The absence of dingo saliva on the clothing. Let's examine each one. The fetal blood. Joy Cole, the forensic biologist, used a chemical reagent called orthotolidine to test stains in the Chamberlain's car. When the reagent turned blue-green, she concluded it was blood. When she examined it under a microscope and saw certain characteristics, she concluded it was fetal blood. But here's what she didn't tell the jury. Orthotolidine reacts to many substances besides blood. Copper compounds, for instance. And the Chamberlain's car, like many cars, had been sprayed with a sound-deadening material that contained copper. She also didn't mention that distinguishing fetal blood from adult blood requires sophisticated testing that she never performed. She testified with absolute certainty about something that was, at best, a preliminary finding requiring confirmation. When independent experts later tested the same samples, they found some of the blood wasn't blood at all. Some samples that tested positive for blood were consistent with Lindy's own blood. She had cut her hand on camping equipment. None of the samples definitively indicated the presence of Azaria's blood. The entire foundation of the prosecution's case, that Azaria had been killed in the car, collapsed under proper scrutiny. The cut marks. Professor James Cameron, a forensic odontologist, dental expert, examined photographs of Azaria's jumpsuit and concluded that the damage was caused by scissors, not animal teeth. His reasoning? The tears were too uniform, too straight, too clean to be animal damage. But he never actually tested his theory. When other researchers later conducted experiments with actual dingo jaws and similar fabric, they found that dingo teeth absolutely could and did create tears that looked exactly like those on Azaria's clothing. Dingoes have sharp teeth. When they bite and pull, fabric tears in relatively straight lines. Professor Cameron had assumed that animal damage would be ragged and irregular. But his assumption was based on theory, not testing. Science should be based on empirical evidence, not assumptions. The absence of dingo saliva. The prosecution argued that if a dingo had carried Azaria in its mouth, there should be detectable saliva on her clothing. None was found, they claimed. But here's what they didn't mention. The clothing had been exposed to rain, sun, and desert conditions for weeks before being found. Any biological material would have degraded significantly. Additionally, the tests used to detect saliva in 1980 were far less sensitive than modern tests. The absence of detected saliva didn't mean saliva was never there, it could mean the tests weren't sensitive enough. Furthermore, subsequent testing did find evidence consistent with canine saliva on the clothing. But this was discovered only after Lindy's conviction. These three forensic failures shared common characteristics. Overconfidence. Experts testified with certainty about findings that should have been presented as tentative. Insufficient testing. Preliminary results were treated as definitive without confirmatory analysis. Confirmation bias. Investigators looked for evidence supporting their theory rather than objectively evaluating all possibilities. Lack of peer review. The forensic work wasn't subjected to rigorous independent review before trial. These aren't unique problems to the Chamberlain case. Studies of wrongful convictions have found that faulty forensic science plays a role in approximately 25% of cases where innocent people are convicted. The problems include exaggerated or misleading expert testimony, forensic disciplines that lack scientific validation, like bite mark analysis, which has been largely debunked. Cognitive bias among forensic examiners who know what the expected result should be. Inadequate standards and oversight in forensic laboratories. The Chamberlain case helped expose these issues in Australia and led to significant reforms. Better training for forensic scientists. Stricter standards for expert testimony. Requirements for confirmatory testing. More rigorous peer review processes. Greater independence for forensic labs from law enforcement. But these problems persist worldwide. In the United States, the National Academy of Sciences published a report in 2009 that found serious deficiencies in many forensic disciplines. The report called for major reforms, many of which still haven't been fully implemented. In other countries, similar issues have been identified but not adequately addressed. The Chamberlain case reminds us that scientific evidence carries enormous weight in courtrooms. Juries trust it. Judges rely on it. Prosecutors build cases around it. But if the science is flawed, if the experts are overconfident, if the testing is inadequate, then innocent people go to prison. And that's exactly what happened to Lindy Chamberlain. The science failed her. The experts failed her. The system failed her. And until we demand better standards, better oversight, and more humility from forensic experts, it will continue to fail others. The media didn't just cover the Chamberlain case. They shaped it. They influenced it. And in many ways, they convicted Lindy before the jury ever deliberated. This is a case study in how media coverage can corrupt justice. Let's examine how it happened. In the early days after Azaria's disappearance, media coverage was sympathetic. Family loses baby to dingo attack, read the headlines. There were photographs of grieving parents. Stories about the dangers of wildlife. Calls for better safety measures at campgrounds. But that didn't sell papers for long. Grief is boring. Tragedy is sad but forgettable. But a murder? A mother who killed her own baby? That's a story that sells. And sell it did. The shift began subtly. Reporters started asking questions. How do we know it was really a dingo? Has anyone verified the mother's story? Is there any evidence besides her word? These are reasonable journalistic questions. But the way they were framed suggested doubt, suspicion, guilt. Then came the analysis of Lindy's behavior. Television programs brought in body language experts, who watched footage of Lindy's interviews and declared that her expressions, her posture, her eye movements indicated deception. This is pseudoscience, by the way. Body language analysis has been thoroughly debunked as a reliable method of detecting lies. But it made for compelling television. Newspapers printed side-by-side photographs, the face of grief next to the face of guilt. Same woman. Same expression. Different captions creating entirely different narratives. The tabloids were the worst offenders. Headlines screamed, "Baby sacrifice?" Dingo story doubted, "Mother's secret past revealed." There was no secret past, they just made things up. They published exclusive interviews with people who barely knew the Chamberlains but were willing to speculate about Lindy's mental state, her marriage, her capacity for violence. Anonymous sources close to the investigation leaked details, true and false, that painted Lindy as suspicious. The coverage created a feedback loop. Media reports influenced public opinion influenced police investigation, police findings fed back to media reports became more sensational, public opinion hardened further. By the time the trial started, finding an impartial jury was nearly impossible. During the trial, media coverage was relentless. Every day brought new headlines analyzing testimony, speculating about evidence, declaring Lindy guilty or innocent based on the latest developments. This violated fundamental principles of justice. In most developed legal systems, there are rules about prejudicial publicity. Media is supposed to report facts, not influence ongoing trials. But those rules were either weak or poorly enforced in Australia in the early 1980s. The coverage wasn't just extensive, it was inflammatory. After Lindy's conviction, the media largely celebrated. "Justice done," proclaimed the headlines. Editorial writers congratulated the police and prosecution. The case was presented as a triumph of scientific investigation over emotional manipulation. Very few journalists questioned whether the verdict was correct. Those who did express doubts were shouted down or ignored. It wasn't until years later, after the jacket was found, after the Royal Commission revealed the forensic failures, after the conviction was overturned, that the media began to change its tune. Slowly, reluctantly, some journalists started to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, they had gotten it wrong. Some newspapers published apologies. Some television programs did retrospectives examining their own role in the miscarriage of justice. But many didn't. And the damage was done. The media's role in the Chamberlain case raised important questions. Should there be stricter rules about trial coverage? Some countries have sub judice laws that prohibit media from publishing information that could prejudice a trial. Australia has since strengthened these rules. What responsibility do journalists have to verify information before publishing? Too many stories in the Chamberlain case were based on rumors, anonymous sources, and speculation presented as fact. How do we balance freedom of the press with fair trial rights? This is a genuine tension in democratic societies. We want media to be able to report on important cases. But we also want defendants to receive fair trials. Who holds the media accountable when they get it wrong? In the Chamberlain case, there were few consequences for the journalists and outlets that published false or misleading information. These questions remain relevant today. In the age of social media, trial by public opinion happens faster and more viciously than ever. Cases like Amanda Knox, the Central Park Five, and countless others show that the lessons of the Chamberlain case haven't been fully learned. Cases still rush to judgment based on incomplete information. Social media still amplifies outrage and suspicion. And innocent people still suffer the consequences. The Chamberlain case should have been a wake-up call about the power and responsibility of media. For some, it was. But for many others, the temptation of a sensational story still outweighs the commitment to accuracy and fairness. And until that changes, wrongful convictions driven by media prejudice will continue to occur. It's now been more than 40 years since Azaria Chamberlain disappeared. The official record is clear: she was killed by a dingo. Lindy Chamberlain Creighton has been fully exonerated. But the echoes of this case still reverberate through Australian society and beyond. Let's examine the lasting impact. For the Chamberlain family. Lindy Chamberlain Creighton is now in her mid-70s. She remarried and built a new life, but she's never escaped the shadow of 1980. She's written multiple books about her experience. She's given countless interviews. She's become an advocate for wrongful conviction reform. But she's also spoken about the lasting psychological damage. PTSD from the trauma of losing her daughter and then being imprisoned for it. Trust issues stemming from being betrayed by systems and institutions. The constant awareness that some people still believe she's guilty. She's said that she's forgiven those who wronged her, but forgiveness doesn't erase trauma. Michael Chamberlain spent the rest of his life until his death in 2017 defending his ex-wife and seeking justice for Azaria. Their children grew up and have largely stayed out of the public eye, though they occasionally speak about the case. The family has never received full compensation for what they lost. No amount of money could compensate them anyway. For Australian society, the Chamberlain case forced Australia to confront some uncomfortable truths about itself. It revealed prejudice, religious prejudice, gender prejudice, class prejudice. It exposed weaknesses in the justice system that many Australians had believed was fair and reliable. It showed how quickly a community could turn on someone based on rumors and appearances rather than evidence. The case became a cultural reference point. When Australians talk about wrongful convictions, they talk about Lindy Chamberlain. When they discuss media bias, they reference this case. When they debate forensic science standards, they point to these failures. It led to concrete reforms. Improved forensic science standards. Better training for expert witnesses. Stricter rules about prejudicial publicity. More robust appeal processes. Greater awareness of confirmation bias in investigations. But it also left scars. Trust in institutions was damaged. Many Australians became more cynical about police, prosecutors, and media. For the justice system worldwide. The Chamberlain case has been studied in law schools around the world as an example of how justice can go wrong. It's cited in discussions of wrongful convictions, forensic science reliability, media influence on trials, gender bias in criminal justice, the danger of common sense assumptions. Documentaries have been made. Books have been written. Academic papers have analyzed every aspect of the case. The 1988 film A Cry in the Dark, called Evil Angels, in Australia, starring Meryl Streep as Lindy, brought international attention to the case and the injustice. The case influenced legal reforms not just in Australia but in other countries that recognized similar vulnerabilities in their own systems. For dingo conservation. Ironically, the case had an impact on how dingoes are perceived and managed. For years after Azaria's death, dingoes were culled aggressively at Uluru and other tourist areas. But eventually, wildlife experts convinced authorities that culling wasn't the answer. Better campground design, education about wildlife safety, and proper food storage were more effective. Today, there are clear warnings at Uluru about dingo dangers. Fences protect camping areas. Rangers actively manage dingo populations and behavior. The 2001 death of a young boy on Fraser Island, killed by dingoes, proved conclusively what should have been believed all along: dingoes can and do attack humans, especially children. That tragedy vindicated Lindy's account but came at the cost of another child's life. Cultural impact. The phrase, "a dingo took my baby," became part of popular culture, unfortunately often used for humor without understanding the tragedy behind it. It appeared in Seinfeld, The Simpsons, and numerous other shows. Many people around the world know the phrase without knowing the real story. This has been painful for the Chamberlain family, seeing their tragedy turned into a joke. But it also keeps the case in public consciousness, which has helped push for continued reforms and awareness. The questions that remain. Even with official vindication, some questions linger. Where is Azaria's body? It was never found. The clothing provided some closure, but not complete closure. Could this happen again? Yes. The conditions that led to this wrongful conviction, media bias, forensic failures, confirmation bias, still exist. Have we learned enough? Partially. Reforms have been made, but wrongful convictions still occur with disturbing regularity. Lindy's own words. In interviews over the years, Lindy has said, "I don't want people to feel sorry for me. I want them to learn from what happened. I want them to demand better from their justice system. I want them to think critically and not rush to judgment." She's also said, Azaria didn't die in vain if her death and what followed leads to even one person being saved from wrongful conviction. That's the legacy she wants, not pity, but change. The final irony. The greatest irony of the Chamberlain case is this. If Azaria had been killed in a car accident, or by illness, or by any other random tragedy, the Chamberlains would have been allowed to grieve in peace. Their daughter would still be dead, but they wouldn't have lost everything else too. Instead, because people couldn't accept that a dingo could take a baby, because media wanted a sensational story, because forensic science was flawed, because confirmation bias drove an investigation, an already grieving family was destroyed. They lost their daughter twice, once to death, and once to injustice. That's the real tragedy of this case. And that's why, more than 40 years later, we're still talking about it. We've reached the end of this tragic story. But before we close, let's reflect on what we can learn from the Chamberlain case. Lesson 1: Question your assumptions. The prosecution, the media, and the public all made the same assumption: dingoes don't attack humans fatally. This assumption was based on the absence of recorded fatal attacks, not on scientific study of dingo behavior. When we assume something is impossible just because it hasn't happened before, we close our minds to evidence. The same pattern appears in countless wrongful convictions. That couldn't happen becomes that didn't happen even when evidence suggests otherwise. Lesson 2: Be skeptical of scientific evidence. Science is a powerful tool, but it's only as good as the methods used and the people applying them. The forensic evidence in the Chamberlain case looked compelling on the surface. A forensic expert testified with confidence. Tests produced results. Photographs showed apparent evidence. But it was all flawed. When you hear scientific evidence in a courtroom, ask questions. What methods were used? Have they been validated? Were confirmatory tests done? Is there peer review? Are there alternative explanations? Don't be dazzled by scientific jargon. Demand actual science. Lesson 3: Recognize bias. Confirmation bias drove this investigation from the start. Once police decided Lindy was guilty, they looked for evidence supporting that conclusion and ignored evidence contradicting it. We all have biases. The question is whether we recognize and correct for them. Investigators should actively look for evidence that contradicts their theory, not just evidence that supports it. Lesson 4: Don't judge grief. Lindy Chamberlain was convicted in the court of public opinion partly because she didn't grieve the right way. But there is no right way to grieve. Some people cry. Some people shut down. Some people stay busy to avoid thinking about their loss. Some people talk about it constantly. Some people never mention it. All of these are valid responses to trauma. Judging someone's innocence or guilt based on their emotional response is not only unreliable, it's cruel. Lesson 5: Media literacy matters. The media played a huge role in prejudicing this case. They repeated rumors as facts. They analyzed behavior instead of evidence. They turned tragedy into entertainment. As consumers of media, we have a responsibility to be critical. Check sources. Look for primary evidence. Distinguish between reporting and speculation. Recognize sensationalism. Don't share unverified information. In the age of social media, we're all part of the media ecosystem. What we share and how we share it matters. Lesson 6: Demand better justice systems. The Chamberlain case revealed systemic failures. Inadequate forensic standards. Prosecution misconduct. Insufficient defendant protections. Weak rules about prejudicial publicity. These aren't unique to Australia in 1980. They exist in justice systems worldwide today. We should demand better training for investigators and prosecutors. Stricter forensic science standards. Robust innocence review processes. Accountability when wrongful convictions occur. Adequate compensation for those wrongly convicted. Lesson 7: Remember the human cost. Behind every wrongful conviction is a person whose life has been destroyed. Lindy Chamberlain spent 3 years in prison. She lost her career, her reputation, her marriage, her mental health. Her children grew up traumatized, stigmatized, damaged. Michael Chamberlain spent decades fighting for justice. And Azaria? A baby who died in a terrible accident and then had her death turned into a spectacle. These were real people, not characters in a true crime story. When we consume true crime content, we should remember that. How to avoid such tragedies? Can we prevent wrongful convictions like this from happening again? Not entirely. Human systems are imperfect. Mistakes will occur. But we can reduce them. Improve forensic science standards, require validation, confirmatory testing, and honest presentation of limitations. Combat confirmation bias, train investigators to actively seek disconfirming evidence. Protect trial integrity, enforce stricter rules about prejudicial publicity. Support innocence projects. Fund organizations that investigate potential wrongful convictions. Reform compensation systems, ensure wrongly convicted people receive adequate compensation. Promote media literacy, teach critical thinking about crime coverage. Demand accountability, hold prosecutors, forensic labs, and media accountable for misconduct. Final thoughts. The disappearance of Azaria Chamberlain was a tragedy. What happened to her family afterward was a different kind of tragedy. One that was entirely preventable. A baby died. A mother was wrongly convicted. A family was destroyed. A nation revealed its capacity for prejudice and rushed to judgment. But from this darkness came some light. Legal reforms that have helped protect others. Greater awareness of forensic science limitations. A cultural reference point that reminds Australians to think critically before condemning. And perhaps most importantly, a story that continues to teach new generations about the fragility of justice and the importance of protecting it. Lindy Chamberlain Creighton is still alive today. She's still advocating for justice reform. She's still telling Azaria's story. Not for fame. Not for money. But so that her daughter's death, and the injustice that followed, might prevent similar tragedies. That's a mother's love, still protecting, still fighting, still hoping for a better world. More than 40 years after that camping trip to Uluru, that's Azaria's true legacy. We've reached the end of this story. What did you learn from it? How do you think we can prevent wrongful convictions like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And please, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing this global community come together to discuss justice and truth. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the importance of critical thinking and compassion, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. There are more stories to tell, more lessons to learn, and more injustices to examine. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for caring enough to learn from the past so we can build a better future. Remember Azaria Chamberlain. Remember her family. And remember that justice is fragile. It requires all of us to protect it.